Welcome to the Cheer Athlete. Today I have with me Patrick Walker, who is from Pennsylvania, and he is the owner of Walker Movement Group. And Patrick, I'm so excited to talk with you today. He helps people with concussions and weekend warriors to help stay off the bench and keep doing what they love and enjoying life along the way. And so I'm very excited to talk to you about concussions today, Patrick. Welcome to the Cheer Athlete.
Thank you, Laura. I'm glad to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about this sort of information that's out there. Mhm.
Super important. I think we don't talk. We're starting conversations more in general sports world about concussions, but concussions are on the rise for cheerleaders, and I know your daughter is a cheerleader. Uh,
Mhm.
and so tell me, how did you get started working with concussions and your journey here today?
Okay. Basically, my story actually goes way back, probably into my teenage years. I have a younger brother who is a stellar athlete. He was a multi-athlete kind of person. He played football, he played lacrosse, he wrestled. So he actually had three of the top uh, risks of getting a concussion from a boy's perspective of things. And watching him get at least 4 to 5 concussions total in his season, and experiencing this while he was performing in a game and everything else. What they didn't know at the time was one thing, and seeing all the effects that it's had on his life afterwards. He still has some post concussive symptoms. So that kind of inspired me to want to do more of this. And as a physical therapist, I've had at least three clients that were had concussions as well, that have got me inspired into learning more of how to help them get better faster and recover to return back to the things they want to do. One lady got hit in the head while sailing, so that was an interesting one. Another one was a school teacher that got hit by a student. She was a special ed teacher. And the third one was just a motor vehicle accident, which is another common incidence rate of concussion.
And you made an interesting point, like, because I think in the past we kind of said, oh, it just has a concussion, rest a little bit, and then, you get right back into it and it's all good. Um, uh, and we're learning now that that's not really the case. Like there's a lot more to it. Um, and can people actually get back into full function, or is this you have a concussion and you're done? Um, so did these people get back to doing active sports and all that stuff?
They do. I mean, they do, but there is. It's more a matter of the timeline of what happens, because most of them, they always don't go off of where some of the athletes, at a certain level, they just, oh, well, my symptoms are good, but they don't realize there's still a latency period of their recovery, that they're still at a risk if they go back and start participating more again. Then they're probably increasing their risk, because they're in still that window of opportunity. If they get a second one, then their symptoms increase, and then they're starting to put themselves more at risk for brain cell death because of what's going on. That's why, in light of all the stuff that we've heard in the sports world, as you can see now with the whole professional football and some of the other people, like the quarterback for Miami was another one that kind of set the tone of people being like, oh, well, he went back too soon. I'm like, he probably does, but I know at that level they have certain protocols they follow, but they don't always necessarily get it, because that's a professional athlete. So some of them want to get back in to making their income. So
Right. Yeah, that's a we could go down a big rabbit hole with that.
exactly.
Um, what are three big things that you've learned about concussions in regards to athletes? That you've learned along the way. Like, is there any? What's the three major things to learn about, or
Hmm.
3 to 5?
Well, I mean, that's always where it breaks down to what the five, you can always go off of the main 5 theories of what concussion is. Some is just a disruption to their blood flow. Some it's just also their inflammatory hormonal, which brings into, especially with female athletes, that's why they're also 2 times more susceptible to getting concussions than men, because it also has to do with their timing of their cycle. That also can play a role into why their symptoms get worse than, say, a man's. Then you also got your typical stuff with their eyes, stuff with their balance, and why they felt dizzy, and it takes them a while for their balance to get better. And then as well, their neck. But then the last one is also psychological, where everybody thinks that, they get really into where, I have a concussion. I'm never going to get better. I'm just, they start thinking that they start having more higher incidence of depression and stuff. That also makes it a little bit tougher. But you also have to know beforehand with some of your athletes, some of your cheer squad, and then anybody else, some of them, you have to kind of get a background of information about them before even knowing what they're going with. Even if they do get a concussion, say one of the cheerleaders, they get a concussion anyway from however it happens. But if you don't find out ahead of time with that they have a history of, anxiety or depression that they're not relating to the coach or anything else, that's going to make their recovery a little bit more affected. So, but it's always to where that's the most interesting thing. It's like, well, you're not crazy. You have this, in spite of everybody telling you, oh, it'll get better, get better, get better. But, it's hard for a lot of the concussion communities out there, athletic or non-athletic, to really understand what's going on. So that's kind of what is always the bigger thing that I have to educate people on. I'm like, look, these could be your potential causes. And that's why sometimes stuff is missed in the medical community, as well as in the, the education of just the general public.
So what I want to make sure I come back to the mood, for lack of a better word. But so we know that concussions on the rise, and we were talking earlier about where cheerleaders fall, like on the stats wise, and so can you talk a little bit more, like, are concussions actually truly a common injury in cheerleading? And what have you learned in your research on concussions for cheerleaders?
Sure. Basically, what I found in the research was looking at the stats for concussion, is that with girls, their top 3 sports, that usually is what it is that their top 3, or actually I should say top 4, is soccer, cheerleading, and basketball and lacrosse. Is the way the kind of the ranking is as far as number of incidents of concussion that it runs from, which was a little bit surprising to me, also being a parent of a daughter who is a cheerleader. But the fact is, what also is interesting is the fact that it parallels to the boys, which boys are football, lacrosse, and wrestling. The fact is, there's a link between the lacrosse and between both girls and boys, that girls actually in the same sport, girls are 2 times more likely to get concussions than boys are, based on a 2011 study. So, which is more interesting in the fact that it's always where sex is actually another risk factor for concussions. So, but yeah, especially with cheerleading, though, it brings it into that sort of factor where it's like, because again, I'm sure you've gotten this before. People always say, well, cheerleading is not a sport. I'm like, yeah, it kind of is if you really look at what's involved into it. So it's always the risk of anything else. It's just like, because cheerleading kind of, actually, I personally link it to like gymnastics too, because I've had friends that are gymnastic coaches. I saw one girl fall off the balance beam and land on her head. I was like, yeah, chances are she got a concussion. I've seen it with girls that have done it at the sports, all the sport events, and see them land. I'm like, okay, may want to get checked out. So, so it is amazing to see that it is such a high incidence of it in the girls' activity level. And what's really also interesting when you're looking at your cheerleading at the high school level, but you and I, we were talking before that you're a high school coach, that apparently 40% of high school athletes did not report having a concussion to their coach. Because so that's been a major factor where, as a coach, you say, oh, yeah, they say, I'm not. So you just continue to put them back into their activity when they could be still having symptoms. They just want to just continue to compete. So, which puts them at a high risk for that. So,
I think there's a couple of points in there that we could touch on, because when I was my last year coaching high school, I was coaching the JV team, and we had, I think, 11 or 12 kids on the team. And that season, 5 girls went out with concussion. As a physical therapist, I was horrified, because I'm like, why are these guys getting injured? Like, how can we have many injuries? Because that's what I try to avoid. Probably 3 of them had prior concussions that I didn't know about, from a youth program, and that led to, and they were mild concussions when they happened, but they were there as it was, and so like 3 of those girls didn't come back that season because they weren't passing the criteria to come back into cheer at that time, and I got like it. It was very frustrating as a coach and as a team, but it made the most sense. Like, they needed to stay out, and like for their health and their longevity in the long term. So one question couple questions. Have you noticed, is there any statistics on bases or flyers or tumblers getting more concussions? Is one question. And then, the second is like, what are some criteria? So hopefully most schools have access to an athletic trainer on site that can assess somebody and at least start that process and send them in the right direction, and then also send them to us for recovery. But what are some criteria that a cheerleader comes out of the stunt, maybe they hit their head, but they kind of come down and they're like, oh no, I'm fine, coach. What are some things that we can look for as coaches, or parents, to say, yes, you can get back into what you're doing, or no, you need to sit out and be done? Like, how do we determine, like, oh no, you need to go get assessed? Because is hitting your head always the same thing? Always going to be a sign?
No, that's always the one thing that people always don't realize too. It's not necessarily that sort of issue, because basically with concussion just means it can just be, it's also more just also a neck issue, or what they call like an acceleration injury, in the fact that if the kid say if it was like, I don't know statistically what the breakdown is for cheerleading as far as the, what they found with the breakdown of position in cheerleading. If flyers are more risk than bases or whatever, but it's also the fact that I could see it from as a physical therapist as well, where both of them can actually have it just based upon landing of execution. That, say a flyer, the base missed hits the flyer, I can understand her hitting her head, but it's also just if they are caught, sometimes just that quick head back motion can be enough to cause the shear into the concussion. That doesn't always mean that it's the old method was just that it is, that your brain actually goes forward and smacks the front of your head and goes to the back. That's an old theory. That it's not even that. It's just that your brain kind of creates a stretch effect. So it's almost like if you took a Jello mold of a brain and you actually shook that a little bit. It's just a shaking it inside your head, but it's not an actual impact, because there's not a there's no direct anatomical thing that happens with a concussion. It's not a direct leak. That's why usually they go to the ER, they send them in for diagnostic tests, be it CAT scan, X-ray, MRI, and they're all going to be negative because there's just not a good test for it. But to answer your other question of, like, as a coach being on the sideline, some of the other things of where you have to decide where they're going to, it's all based on your diagnosis of when to send them is just based on their it's symptomatic driven. It's not a specific diagnosis, because it's just a matter of if their headache gets worse, if they're having, obvious weakness and in their arms and legs, they become less alert. If their vision gets affected, if they're having trouble speaking or swallowing, any loss of balance, you obviously immediately want to say, no, you have to go straight to the ER, or just make sure there's not something else going on at the other level. But it's also where, as a parent, you may just still want to continue to keep an eye on them, just because if, as a parent, if you start noticing after they're home, they start, that they're having weakness in their arms and legs, they're unsteady on their feet, they start to slur their speech. And obviously the biggest immediate thing is too, if they have any bruising behind their ears, or any fluid leaking from their ears, that's immediate go straight to the ER, because that's probably that they got a skull fracture. So, but you don't always see it because you're not going to look at that until you are. So that's sort of what my take is on a general sort of thing, and that's what I'm looking at from that perspective of getting more people educated and trying to get more out there with all these groups. That's why I said it's one of those sort of things where I'd like to, with my daughter's squad, she does compete at a rec level. She now starting to compete at the middle school level, and then pretty much she's already been recruited already early on to the high school level. So as that, I think that's just my perspective of wanting to help the coaches be more aware and just be like, this is where you need to tell them, or get also the coach moms or cheer moms as well, to make them be aware. This is some of the things, that I think you would need to do, and just give them some more education. Just look, these are the main sort of things you need to look at. I'm not trying to make you anxious, but I'm also trying to make you more aware that sometimes you may just have to, if you feel unsteady, it's better to just be safe, take them to the ER, get assessed by a medical professional, and then go from there.
Yeah, that I think that's the key takeaway. Like, they may or may not show symptoms as they come down out of a stunt, but those symptoms may progress later on. And coaches need to be aware, and even just talking with the parents, hey, this stunt came down a little weird today, or I was seeing something off, I'm not really sure, so keep an eye on your cheerleader. And parents, doesn't mean you have to be scared and hyper vigilant and like standing over them all night, but if you are starting to notice changes, like take them in to get assessed, and hopefully there's some concussion specialists in the area. It's always, because there are different protocols and different assessment tests that can be done to determine what their brain level is doing and where they're at. So I think that's a key takeaway. Do you think concussions can be prevented, and or if not, or is there a way to reduce our risk of concussion? Because I don't think anything can be prevented altogether, but is there a way to reduce the risk? And what do we do post concussion? Are there, what tips can you give to helping somebody get back after a concussion?
Yeah, there's definitely it's all a matter of, like you said, you're not going to fully prevent this, because there's just so much external factors that go into this whole environment. You cannot control everything, and that's why they've done, and that's why it's also to where they've done studies, even at, with even other sports outside of cheerleading. There's been studies with, football and everything else, where they try and give these kids better helmets, and that does not show any decreased risk. Everybody thinks, oh, we just have to do that, or we have to just change the field environment, or change that, or put mats up. And it's not necessarily that, because the ground is the ground, no matter if you're put on a mat, if you're on those surfaces that the cheerleaders use, or any of the mats in general when they're just practicing. That's still a ground reaction force. It's still going to get you no matter what. So it's tough to do that for that perspective. But prevention wise, it's more so of just some of it. There is still back and forth research out there by strengthening their cervical muscles, their neck muscles a little bit more. You can minimize some of that. I think some of it is just doing sometimes it's a matter of also having a baseline testing of kids before they participate in certain sports. So if after an event, you retest their baseline. If they're back to their baseline, you know that you're okay to resume what you're going to do. But it's also tough when you also, as a coach, to have somebody that would be willing to administer, say, testing to 15 to 20 kids in a session. But I mean, but there are specific tests. There are certain tests, though, unfortunately, there are some tests and stuff that kids can cheat on to make it seem like they can get past it. So there are certain psychosomatic tests that can be done. They start to realize that. But so going back to prevention or anything else that they can do, it's more so just sometimes it's just a matter of knowing the kids, knowing your kids' medical history, learning that, letting the coaches know of your kids' medical history. I know there's certain, obviously not disclosing, it's just you have to disclose to a coach or anything else just so they can be aware if a child has any mental health, psychological issues going on, if they are diagnosed with anxiety or depression, to let the coach be aware, just so that if this sort of incident, if you're aware of that they're not trying to, that hopefully, say they have a rough day of practice, that it's not, I'll tell you that it is the concussion. Sometimes it's not, it's just their behavior that's doing it too. So it's always just alerting that is one of the other things to kind of help prevent it. And I think it's just a matter of knowing that that there unfortunately is not any sort of testing that can be done medically, that the doctors do, oh, you have a concussion. Or some of these people that I've had, talking to people that I've known in other sports, they're like, oh, this is my 5th or 6th one. It's like, well, okay. Well, it's like sometimes you just can't completely stop them from it. Do you try and prevent it? But sometimes it's just a matter of, well, you're always just, well, what was your symptoms on this one? Did you have any symptoms? What was your, how'd you feel after this last one? How long was it before you got your next one? And knowing the window of when they've had them, if they've had 2 in a very short period of time, then you're like, okay, well, you may need to do stuff to modify your activity or take it out for a little bit. And then you have to just look at some of the other factors of ruling out any other sort of factors, that could be something underlying that makes them more risk, which is more anatomical or physiological that they could have, or it could also be hormonal, that sometimes the hormones is just also what's doing it, to where that's where sometimes if they've had multiple ones, that'd be one thing. It's like, well, if you had it a couple of times, you may need to see, not like, especially like a naturopathic doctor, somebody that actually will test hormones just to see what they're at, especially with your female athletes. Because again, it goes back to menstrual cycle and everything else. It's where that can also be like, oh, that's why, because you were partly in it, that's why your symptoms got worse. Or this, you just had it, you competed right at the time of this, so that's why you felt more, you're more at risk of getting it because of that. It just kind of coincides to there.
So you're not saying like, that you're saying the menstrual cycle can affect symptoms post concussion, but also could potentially, during the time of your cycle, could be a higher risk of getting a concussion. Nothing we can do about that. Like, even with medication to control hormones, you're still going to fluctuate and still going to do that. So it's not necessarily anything in control, but it's an awareness of it. And, okay, so, and we as women tend to be like, yes, we can do everything all the time, and it doesn't matter where we are in our cycle. But truth is, like, things change, and like your ligaments will get looser. So your brain might, just like any other injury, might need some awareness. And it doesn't mean you stop doing stuff. It just means be aware. Like, I think that's the key on prevention or reduction, is like, what is our awareness? I love the pre-screening. And I really hope we start to get this going across the board around the world, like pre-screening, for, are they ready to go? And 1, do they have the ability and the strength to do something? But 2, where are they at? You have a baseline. So if an injury does happen, where they need to be to get to to return, and that gives you a better sign, because sometimes you don't know what they're past, where they're at. But if we have a starting point, then we know where they can get back to get back to that to get back out in the field.
Right.
Go ahead.
I think that's also that there's certain things that you can, and then also with certain sports and everything else, with cheerleading is not as regimented as, say, gymnastics, where you have to have certain weight or anything else. But sometimes you also have to look at your athlete's nutrition profile too. That also will do some of that, because there is definitely research out there when you're talking with prevention and recovery. You're talking about making sure that they're not dealing with issues with leaky gut or anything else where they're having that, because that has been shown to affect brain activity. And that's where some of those can also be that if your athlete is eating not a healthy diet, your diet consists mainly of just Chick-fil-A and that's it. It's going to put them at a risk of having other factors that can put them at that sort of risk of having poor performance, as well as everything else that could put a little bit more of a risk on them to also do that. But also, if they're on a better control of their nutrition, they'll also be in a better state of mind beforehand. So
yeah, and have all better energy and better able to control everything on that. So absolutely. Just real quick on the cognitive and the state, like I know one thing people in the past have always, oh, it's just a concussion, no big deal. They'll get back in it, no problem. One might be if it's a, small injury and they have very minimal symptoms and they recover that quickly. But a second, it's the same with any injury, really. Like, once you had an injury, it's a higher risk for having a second injury. So, and they have compound effects. And I know there's been a large amount of I'm going to say football athletes that, the person that comes to mind is not, Tua, but Junior Seau, because he played for the Patriots, and they attributed the multiple concussions that led to his suicide and just cognitive changes. And the same with the one we don't speak about, who did some terrible things, Hernandez, but that, that that's not to scare people, but like concussion is a big deal. And, we need to pay attention to the symptoms. We need to pay attention to all the factors that go into what your brain is telling you. And let the brain recover and let your body recover and get you back to that baseline, so that you stay in mental. And there's a big, or I've heard that there's, like you can work with sports psychologists and people to help you process what your body's going through, and that's a whole other topic for getting into. But anything is I just want to make sure that people are aware, like it's very important. Like if you have a prior history, like is this your baseline, depression, anxiety, whatever? And if not, concussion might be a contributing factor to that. And so let's take some steps to manage that. Have you found that do you see, are you seeing that? My camera likes to zoom.
I think it's just, it's, when you're talking that level of what they call CTE, cumulative traumatic encephalopathy, I think with the CTE, it's very tough to really show that there's a link to it. Just as well with the cognitive, they've done studies on, the biggest studies have been on hockey players per se, but a lot of the studies in the NHL hockey players that, all the ones that talk about memory deficits and whatnot, they've done cognitive testing on them, and they found that they really don't have a memory deficit. It's just their perceivement of it is what's doing it. But all the research says the testing, they pass all these tests. It's like, you really don't have a memory deficit. You're just trying to think of it, that you're just trying to link it to that. It's just, well, sometimes it's not necessarily that. Just like how with some of the football players, they've done studies, big studies on college to pro athletes, and some of them just are not showing cognitive issues. And so they cannot definitively say this is what it is. And that's why, unfortunately, you can't be even diagnosed with the CTE, and trying to link that back is tough to do because it has to be done after their death, just like with Junior Seau and Hernandez. They would actually have to do dissections of the brain. Yeah, this is probably why. That's why they link it to that. It's like, well, it must be because of how that factor is. But there is, but that I say, it's anything else. You always just have to have professionals that can handle that sort of stuff, so that it could be that, or it's just anything else. With some of these other athletes, it's just you have to prepare them for life after their sport, because a lot of them is probably part of the reasons why is they're out of the spotlight, so they also cannot handle that transition sometimes unless they're speaking to, say, a licensed therapist or somebody else that can help them make that transition. I think even with some of them are starting to realize now that there should be more of an earlier sort of step into, all right, you're starting to come to the end of your career or anything else like that. But even with, say, I wonder if this would be true too with your audience of cheerleaders, that if you look at the professional cheerleaders, say, biggest example is just the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, for example. If you look at those girls, I'm sure they've had injuries, they've had concussions, that it's like, but then they start getting, they have to be released from the squad. Sometimes that can affect them mentally to be like, oh, shoot, now I cannot do this anymore because of this. And sometimes they can't handle that. And that's where some of that change in the spotlight is a little bit hard for them, just like the ones that make it to the squad and then they get cut from the squad the next season. It's like, that's going to be another thing. That's a whole nother topic. But I think that's also where you start to see some of that sort of issues of that too. So,
yeah. And I think as we get, there's starting to be more professional cheerleading shows and the Olympics. I mean, I think the Olympics is going to be a big, when we get there in 2028, I think is the projected date. Like, as people are starting to train for that, it's going to be, people get, for whatever reason they have injuries, like it's going to be a big factor in mental health and all of the above, and how, so Patrick, do you have any, what are you working on right now? Where are you? Like, I love that your goal is to educate people about concussions. And that's huge. So tell us a little bit more, like, do you have what are you working on?
I'm still building up my website a little bit more that has more education, having a blog more about this for the communities. That'll also target to not only necessarily, mainly my main target is all the younger athletes, the middle school, high school levels, and some college, as well as trying to just also get stuff out there to anybody else that had it. I had a concussion from other factors outside of sports, and just kind of let them to be alert or aware, alert, and just trying to direct them into to give them the map of where people they would need to see, because not always necessarily have to see a physical therapist. You don't necessarily have to go see a concussion specialist. And I've had one person that has told me they went and saw a concussion specialist that's renowned in the area where I live. And apparently he just said, oh, it'll just, he really had nothing to say. He just said, oh, it's just going to take time. And it's just, there's nothing really I can do for you. But I think if you also take it into the factor of just the other symptoms of what they have, is trying to point them into the professionals to help them with those sort of things, because it's not always just, concussion is not always just a one step approach. That's, oh, you have a concussion, go see a PT. Sometimes it can be but the PT, sometimes myself, I may have to refer out. So that's why I'm trying to develop more of a network. So if people go to my website, it's just more of trying to link and say, you need to talk to so-and-so. You need to talk to this doctor who is a such and such. You need to talk to this nutritionist or not nutritionist / dietitian, who may be able to help you as far as getting on a better anti-inflammatory diet to help your symptoms and stuff like that. So it's not I just want to basically encompass everything with concussion so that they have a place to go to where they can feel more comfortable and understand that they're not crazy, because I always feel like that's the hardest perception for people is, oh, you had your concussion a year ago, you should be better. Not necessarily, because they probably just haven't gotten the right intervention to fix their issues, and it may take time still, which nobody likes to hear time, but
Yeah.
it is still a factor of where it's just you have to have the right sort of people to point you into the right direction.
That's awesome. So we'll keep an eye out for that collaboration and the information as we go forward. Where can people reach you if they want to learn more or talk more about concussion, or it sounds like you're getting some good connections to building those. So where can people reach you?
Um, I would like to direct them to my website, but it's still under construction. So if they just want to bookmark it or anything else, they certainly can just bookmark it to walkermovementgroup.com. WALKER movement GROUP.com is my main website. But if it says it's under construction, just bear in mind it's just a matter of just a couple of minor tweaks I have to get up. But that'll be one thing. If they certainly want to follow me, I'm also on Instagram with Walker Movement Group. They'll be, of course, there. I also have a Facebook called Concussion Roadmap as well, which gives them kind of a general snippet of what a concussion is, so they start to get some of that and some other little tidbits of information about sleep and things of that nature to help them start to adjust with everything else there. So that would be the main sort of things that they wanted to reach out to me. So, and that would be the biggest things. Just they can certainly DM me if they want any more information about it. I have no problem responding to anybody's questions. And that's why I'm always trying to get it to more a worldwide sort of approach to, I've worked with one guy who was from Canada. So being in the States and having a guy in Canada, it was more of a, telehealth sort of session of just trying to direct him where he needs to go, what sort of things to address that. So that's also why I think there really has to be my passion is to bring a universal acknowledgement and trying to just bring this so that everybody in the world can have some sort of care for it with all their kids or any other athletic population, be it whatever sport they're in.
Awesome. I love that roadmap, and I will definitely post the links to all of that. And if you are questioning if your child has had a concussion, definitely check out Patrick's info and reach out. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let us know what, as things progress, and if there's anything new coming out, or if you learn anything as you're, at your own daughter's competitions and practices and seeing that go. Like, if there's anything that you want to share with us, please let us know. I'd love to have you back again too.
Absolutely. So, all right. Well, thanks so much. And one last thing also, that from a coaching, this is just more of a side note. I just thought of it, is the fact of there is actually scientific stuff for recovery as well as from your cheerleaders. If they want to improve their athletic performance, there's definitely something called blood flow restriction. I'd certainly be happy to be on your podcast to explain a little bit more of how to increase their performance with jumping and all the other stuff for your flyers and everything else. So.
Yeah, I'm 100% want to talk with you about that. That's like been in the back of my mind, and I was going to ask you after. So I'm glad you brought that up. So stay tuned, because I'm just starting to learn about blood flow restriction, but I've heard that it can do great things for improving flexibility, for performance in general, and strength. So I definitely want to talk to you about that going forward. So that's cool. And I want to go learn more about it myself too.
I gotcha. All right.
All right, everybody. That's the end of the Cheer Athlete podcast for today. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And all the links will be in the show notes. Don't forget, when in doubt, breathe it out. Take life one step at a time. And as my friend Drew Kelleher said, you are responsible for your own vibes. Make it a great day, and we'll talk to you next time. Take care.